4. From the time that I was a small child, I saw people working hard. I grew up amongst such people. At home, my mother and my grandmother labored from sunrise to sunset without any rest. And to this day, in my village, both men and women can survive only through hard and incessant labor. There is work of various kinds. If you look at agricultural labor, there's plowing, manuring, watering, sowing the seed, separating the seedlings and planting them out, then, weeding, spraying the fields with fertilizer, reaping the grain, working on the threshing floors, planting groundnut, selecting red coconuts. All this. Apart from this work in the fields, there's construction labor, digging wells, carrying loads of earth, gravel and stone. If even this is not available, then people have to go up to the hills to gather firewood, or they must work with palm leaves, or at the kilns making bricks. People have to do some work in order to eat. More than 3/4 of the land in these parts is in the hands of the Nikers. People of our community work for them, each pariah family attached to a Niker family, as Panayal, bonded laborers. As far as I have seen, it is only Pala and pariah communities who work in this way. Other communities don't have to work so hard. The Korvar or gypsies and leather-working Chakiliyar would sweep the streets, dredge and clean the drains, and make a living that way. Sometimes they wove winnowing trays, boxes, baskets for carrying paddy, and chicken coops, and earned a few coins that way. Everyone in my community had to work hard for their livelihood. Only a few of the teachers' families lived with any degree of comfort. Everybody said that my potty was a true and proper servant. She worked as a labor to a Niker family, but she was also a kothal. She hired laborers for them, brought them to work regularly, supervised them, and made sure they received their wages. Except for Sundays, she went to work every single day. Sometimes, if the Niker insisted, she would rush through Pasai before daylight on Sunday, and then run to work. She'd rise before cockcrow at 2 or 3 in the morning, draw water, see to the household chores, walk a long distance to the Niker's house, work till sunset, and then come home in the dark and cook a little gruel for herself. When I was a bit older, Potty used to take me to the fields with her. We were not a household with many comforts or conveniences. During the school term, as soon as lessons were over, I'd go and collect such things as the thorns used for fences, or palmyra and coconut palm stems and fronds for fuel. I would collect fresh cow dung and pat it into flat cakes for burning. Sometimes I would go into the fields and pick up dried cow dung. During the school holidays, I would go with Potty or some other woman to work in the fields. Most often I helped to pull up the groundnut crop and to clean and sort the pods. To pull up the groundnut crop and to clean and separate the pods, you had to wake up very early, well before cock crow, pour some millet porridge into a carrying vessel, and run with it. In the fields, you had to pull up a heap of groundnut plants and then sit down to pulling off the pods. At midday break, we would drink our cuz along with a mouthful of fresh nuts. We would separate and clean the pods until sunset time, and then carry them to the Nikers' granaries. There the Nikers' Panayal would measure the cleaned groundnuts by the miracle, and pay us 5 or 10 pays for each miracle. However hard you strained yourself, it never came to more than 5 rupees in all. We'd take what we were given, and come home only at dusk. After we came home, we'd buy a little rice, light the hearth and cook some gruel. If we were going to glean the last of the groundnut crop that was left over in the fields, we would go somewhat later. We'd go here and there all over the fields where the groundnut crop had been pulled up, and use our shovels at random to hammer into the earth and rake it, so that we could pick up all the stray groundnuts. The Nikers were never happy about this, though. They would chase us, throw stones and pieces of wood at us and drive us away. Occasionally, some of the Nikers would allow us to glean and strip the fields on condition that we gave them half or a third of what we had found. If we found any groundnuts, well and good. If not, we had nothing. In any case, the Nikers would only let us go home in the evening, after they had taken their share. We would take what was left to the Chekgadi, the bazaar where the oil press was at one time, sell it to the tradesmen there and buy some rice or a little broken grain. You couldn't put the broken grain gruel in your mouth. It stank so much. But if we had no money, broken grain gruel was all we could eat. Sometimes I sold my groundnuts and brought the money home to my mother. Sometimes, I just gave her the groundnuts. We'd go at daybreak to the Nikers' house to shell the groundnuts. Here they would measure out the dried groundnuts to us by the miracle. We'd sit in the cattle shed, take up the groundnuts in both hands alternately and break the shells by smashing them against the floor. If we were in a great hurry, we'd use both hands as well as our teeth to shell the groundnuts. If you used your teeth, your mouth would fill with dust and your throat would choke. But could one afford to bother about all that? We had to work as hard as we could to shell all the nuts. At the same time, we had to be careful not to crack the nuts themselves. If too many of the nuts were broken, the Niker would be really angry. You can't use broken nuts as seeds, can you? That's why. If we chatted in between shelling, or ate 1 or 2 of the nuts, that was it. Niker would be furious and swear at us, using every term of abuse he knew. They paid us 5 to 10 paisa per miracle. So we didn't make that much money this way either. At the very most, we'd make 5 or 6 rupees. Even so, I went with Potty to shell groundnuts. If none of this work was available, I'd go off to collect stray onions left in the field or thorny twigs. Some days I'd go with other children to collect firewood from the mountain jungle. On such days, I'd wake up in the early morning, pour some cuz into a carrier and collect 4 annas from my mother to give to the garter or forester. If we didn't give any money to the garter, he would not allow us to collect any firewood. He lived in the forestry bungalow and had a habit of coming round on inspection unexpectedly. It wasn't that easy to go into the jungle. We had to climb the steep mountain slopes one by one, pick up the dried pieces of wood that lay here and there, and then tie them together into bundles. Before you could manage to do this, the twigs and thorns would scratch and tear your face, your hair, your arms and legs. Sometimes your skin would be all torn and bleeding. But if you worried about all this, there was no way you could gather firewood. Sometimes your hair would get all entangled in the branches and nearly split your skull apart. You never knew which way to go forward. What roads or paths were there for you to take? We had to push and shove and crawl our way through bushes and briars. After all this struggle and hardship, you couldn't just tie up your bundle, lift it onto your head, and walk home. Something would pull you back here, a tree or a creeper would block your way there. So you could never climb down the hill easily. You had to creep along gradually, slowly rolling the firewood bundle forward. Having reached the base of the hill one way or another, you could then carry your bundle on your head and walk home, by which time, what little energy that was left in you would have ebbed away, and the load would feel really heavy. It wasn't a short distance, after all, between the mountain jungle and our village. The others would bring their bundles to the Niker street and sell them for 7 or 8 rupees each. But I never actually sold a bundle of firewood. I took mine home for our use. In those days, my mother too used to go collecting firewood. On one occasion she brought home a bundle of firewood, leaned it against the wall, and then began vomiting vast gobs of blood. But it was only by toiling like this, without taking any account of their bodies as human flesh and blood, that people of my community could even survive. As soon as children grew up to be 10 or 12 years of age, they'd go and find some way of making money. Until that time, they'd go about carrying their younger siblings on their hips. They'd even gather a few twigs and sticks and learn to boil a little gruel. It was always the girl children who had to look after all the chores at home. The older women would come home in the evenings after a day's work and then see to the household jobs. If there were boys in the house, they would graze the sheep and cattle. When they grew a bit older, they'd go off to work in the fields like the older men. When it was harvest time, we used to take a wide winnowing tray and stiff broom and go and stand by the lake shore or even by the bank of the filthy canal, so that we could sweep and gather up the ears of grain falling off the sheaves that were being carried to the threshing floor. We'd winnow the grain we collected and take it home. But it was only the young children and the old women who did this. Grown up girls and women in their prime, though, went directly to the fields, winnowed the grain there by the basketful, and were paid in kind. In this way, whatever we made, either by picking up the scattered grain with great difficulty, or from winnowing it in the fields, we then took to the shops. There were not our men who would set up shop in our streets, weigh the grain and take it in exchange for tapioca or some such other goods. And at that time, we never realized how badly we were swindled during these bartering sessions. In exactly the same way, when the cotton pods burst, we'd bring the cotton we gathered and exchange it for goods. The tradesmen always managed to collect several bundles of cotton or grain for themselves by cheating us. Our hard work was exploited half the time by our Niker employers. The rest of the time we were swindled by these tradesmen. So how was it possible for us to make any progress? It seems that it is only the swindlers who manage to advance themselves. But there is no way at all for the Dalit who sticks to fair methods and who toils hard all her life to make good. Until the time that I was in the 8th class, I worked in my village in all these ways. All the time I went to work for the Nikers. I knew I should not touch their goods or chattels, I should never come close to where they were, I should always stand away to one side. These were their rules. I often felt pained and ashamed. But there was nothing that I could do. They belonged to a higher caste. They had the money. We had to listen to what they said. However furious or resentful I felt in my heart, I have stepped aside for them, along with the other women of my community. I was admitted into the convent school in the nearby village so that I could attend the 9th class. There I did not have to work all the time like this. I ate my meals and I studied, that was all. During the holidays I returned to my own village. Children who boarded at the convent and studied there certainly had a special status in our village. All the same, when I went home I did all the chores that fell to me customarily. After the 10th class, I finished my final exams and went home. My mother was walking from the street of the Nikers with a bundle on her head, made up of mango wood which she had gathered and tied together. I went along with her, back and forth, with 2 or 3 headloads of firewood, which I gathered for her. To come to our part of village from the Niker street, you had to cross the Nader street, the Tever street, and then come past the oil press and bazaar. Some people who had seen me carrying the firewood said to my mother with astonishment, "Your daughter has finished her schooling at the convent, yet she doesn't mind carrying firewood like this." I don't know why they were so surprised. In those days I really enjoyed that kind of hard physical labor. It is only recently that I find I cannot do it anymore. Because I've been to other places and have been engaged in studying different things, I find that my body isn't as flexible as it used to be. When I saw our people working so hard night and day, I often used to wonder from where they got their strength. And I used to think that at the rate they worked, men and women both, every single day, they should really be able to advance themselves. But of course, they never received a payment that was appropriate to their labor. And another thing. Even if they did the same work, men received one wage, women another. They always paid men more. I could never understand why. Even though they worked so hard and suffered bodily pain, our people laughed and were cheerful. This is a community that was born to work. And however hard they toil, it is the same cause every day. The same broken grain gruel. The same watery dried fish curry. It seems they never ever reflect upon their own terrible state of affairs. But do they have any time to think? You have to wonder how the upper castes would survive without these people. For it's only when they fall asleep at night that their arms and legs are still, they seem to be at work at all other times. And they have to keep working until the moment of death. It is only in this way that they can even half fill their bellies. Mind you, things get steadily worse and worse. In the old days, it is true, even tiny tots would hold onto sheep and cattle and look after babies as they tumbled about in the streets around their houses. Nowadays, poor things, they go to work like adults. At crack of dawn, even before the Madurai bus makes its appearance, these days, the van from the matchbox factory will arrive. These tiny crab-like children pour their cuz into their carriers half asleep, totter along to the van, climb in, and go off to work. They work at sticking on matchbox labels, they make firecrackers and use chemicals, and they return home exhausted, at 7 in the evening. At an age when they should be going to school, studying like everyone else and playing about in the evenings, they are shut up inside the factories instead. There are 2 or 3 schools available for the children nowadays. But these little ones' fate is the smell of matchbox solution, not the smell of knowledge or learning. How can they afford to study, when it is such a struggle even to fill their bellies?